Today's episode is sponsored by Bear Attack Boxing, by boxers and for boxers, producing high quality boxing gloves, boxing equipment, Muay Thai, kickboxing, all sorts of fantastic boxing products. And I just want to bring your attention to a new product which has been brought out by Bear Attack Boxing, which is the Checkerboard boxing gloves. They are available in 12 ounce and for the price of only £39. The new Checkerboard gloves are the ideal training glove for a beginner or a seasoned pro. With the lightweight feel and wrist flexibility, you can freely fire your shots while still having the hand and wrist protection that you need. Whether it's training on the pads or it's on the heavy bag, make sure you're training with Checkerboard gloves. Go over and find them, bearattackboxing.co.uk. Find them on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Check out all the other available equipment that they produce. And again, you can find them www.bearattackboxing.co.uk.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss, a tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened. It happened. Uppercut by Douglas. Down goes Tyson.
Thompson, right hand shot.
Lennox Lewis knocks out Mike Tyson.
Slumps to the canvas.
The champion struggles to stay on his feet.
How do you like it? How do you like it?
Welcome, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast with myself, Sean Bastow, shortly to be joined by Johnston Brown. And in this episode, here's the tale of Evander Holyfield versus Lennox Lewis from March 1999. It was the Undisputed Unified Heavyweight Championship of the world. All the recognised titles at that time were on the line. A great event, voted for by you, the users of Twitter, the listeners of BTR Boxing Podcast. We really appreciate you doing that. Now go and find us, check us out on social media. We are on BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook too. Subscribe to us, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Stitcher, Spreaker, Player FM. We're on all good available podcasting apps out there. If you are subscribing to us already, please go on there and leave us a review. It really helps us. We really appreciate the support. So, today's episode of Legendary Nights, this is the tale of Evander Holyfield versus Lennox Lewis. So this is it, Johnston. This is the tale of Evander Holyfield versus Lennox Lewis from March 1999, as voted for by the users of Twitter. Thank you so much for getting involved with this one, in which is a week of controversial decisions and controversial outcomes in fights. So, what about this fight then? What about this one? Holyfield versus Lewis, part of a saga, part of a Legendary Nights series which involves such epic fights, and this one is no different. And although we're going to discuss the fight itself and discuss all the build-up to things, and people might not think of this as, oh well, this wasn't really the best of fights, it was more about the controversy over it, which is why when it went out on social media, it was about controversial decisions in fights. And obviously this was up against, like you say, the Whittaker Chavez, and it was up against De La Hoya Trinidad, but this one came out on top.
Yeah, and I think it was a great pick. I mean, it held huge significance on the heavyweight scene at the time, and rightly so. I mean, these two are worthy two best heavyweights. Obviously, Tyson was still around at the time, but this was a big fight. Obviously, it was billed as Holyfield Lewis, and it was a massive pay-per-view event on HBO and on Sky. And I mean, I was excited about the fight at the time when it come up. And you know, it didn't live up to the hype, as you say, but obviously the controversy there that surrounded it was pretty shocking, really.
So let's go through as we always then. Let's touch on the careers of both men. Let's touch on the build-up, touch on the fight and the aftermath. So going into it first, it was billed as Holyfield versus Lennox Lewis, and Holyfield's career is obviously one of Hall of Fame standard. due to the fact that he wasn't just a heavyweight. People that don't know Evander Holyfield, again, I don't know where you've been hiding and why you're listening to this episode, but he was also a fantastic cruiserweight in the 80s, winning multiple titles in the cruiserweight division before eventually moving up to the heavyweight division, which was in 1989. So we're going to go back to 1989 really and sort of briefly touch through some of the stuff there where his career in the heavyweight division started to take off. He won a couple of titles in the late 80s, early 90s, which were like, again, just like a rankings titles really. WBC Continental Americas title was something you'd consider today as like your international silver belts and things of that nature. But it was really when 1990 came around which he came onto the scene in the heavyweight division by defeating a newly crowned James Buster Douglas to become the IBF, WBA and WBC heavyweight champion of the world.
Yeah, of course, Buster Douglas. We all know that he was the man that got rid of Tyson. It was Tyson's first ever defeat, and it was a shocker, unbelievable in terms of no one expected it. Everyone expected him to just get blasted out by Tyson as he had done. And Douglas obviously picked up the win. I think originally there was the long count situation without sort of going off on a sort of tandem here, but with Douglas, if anyone has never seen the fight, Tyson still says to this day that it was a long count when he put Douglas down. So there was a lot of politics around it where a couple of, I think it was the WBA and the WBC that wouldn't recognise Douglas as their champion. And then after a little bit of, I think about a few days later, eventually they gave him, recognition. And then Don King was obviously pressing to get the rematch, but Douglas ended up leaving Don King, and then he decided to fight Holyfield, who was, as you say, the new up-and-coming heavyweight at the time, and he was a lot lighter, and a lot of people were a bit unsure whether Holyfield could cut it at the heavyweight scene. He'd already proven himself in a couple of fights, and he took his chance, and obviously he picked up the titles, which was a great performance from Holyfield.
And then he goes on in his next fight and goes and fights, obviously, George Foreman, the guy who returned and also created history himself in the 90s. So he beats George Foreman via a unanimous decision, beats Burt Cooper, which from what I recall was a really good fight, and then beats an aged Larry Holmes via a unanimous decision, before bumping in to what is definitely going to be a legendary night at some point of this series, Riddick Bowe in 1992, where he lost via a unanimous decision.
Oh, absolute brilliant fight. It actually got Ring Fight of the Year, and it also, the 10th round in particular, got Round of the Year. It's an absolute belter. A lot of people were a little bit sceptical about Holyfield, whether he could withstand the power of Bowe, and Bowe did. I mean, he caught him several times, and Holyfield proved he had a granite chin and an absolute unbelievable heart, which we sort of already knew, but not in the heavyweight division. And 100% this has got to be a legendary night at some point, Sean. It was an absolute brilliant fight.
Yeah, it was. And it's the start of something that went on to be, like we said earlier there, an epic trilogy for sure. So obviously he fights Riddick Bowe again in 93, gets the titles back from Riddick Bowe with a majority decision, and this was only for the IBF and WBA as well. Then loses to Michael Moorer in 1994, who then went on to lose to George Foreman in the same year, making him the oldest heavyweight champion of all time at the age of 46. Then went on to fight Riddick Bowe again and lost via a TKO in 95. And I think this was I don't know, was this the point where he had the heart scare, or was that before this third fight? I can't remember.
I think it was around this time. The timeline of it, I'm not 100% sure. I do remember hearing about it, and then I think he had a medical. They said he had something wrong with his heart, and then he went, because he was a very religious guy, Evander Holyfield, and he went to see his pastor, and he worked miracles apparently, and he said if you go back to your doctor, your heart will be cured. And then Holyfield, obviously being a very religious man, went back to the doctors, and they said he'd been cleared. So, was it a miracle? We don't know. I'm guessing what most people are assuming is that it was just the original medical was just, they done it. It was wrong, basically. They're given the wrong results. He had obviously that difficult. But one thing just before we move on, that second fight, if anyone doesn't remember the second fight against Riddick Bowe, you remember it for James, the Fireman Miller landed in the ring in the 7th round, delaying the fight for 21 minutes. So, I can have a look at that one, because that is an unbelievable. It's just bizarre, basically. It's bizarre. But yeah, moving back to the third fight, obviously he got done by Bo. But yeah, it was definitely heart complication. I'm not quite sure when it was though, Sean.
So then from there he bumps into Mike Tyson, which again, I don't know, would you class them as legendary nights? Because the fights of Mike Tyson were two epic fights of their own, because Tyson had obviously come out of prison after his rape conviction. He'd come back, he'd look ferocious, he'd look like the old Tyson, people were fearing him. He destroyed our beloved Frank Bruno early on in 1996 to win the heavyweight title of the world, and then he came and got into the ring with Evander Holyfield, who completely broke Tyson's heart in the first fight and frustrated him and stopped Mike Tyson. I think it was the 10th or 11th round of that particular fight, but I know it was later on down the line of the fight. It was a great fight to watch, because you expected that Tyson was going to be the guy who'd just roll over Holyfield, and he was going to continue where he left off earlier on in his career. But it wasn't to be. Obviously, Evander Holyfield's heart and determination won over in this particular one, and he beats Tyson. And then the next year, he fights him again, in what was, again, an infamous fight for the disqualification after Mike Tyson bit off and spat down in the middle of the ring a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear.
I was in disbelief. I mean, the first fight, I think Tyson sort of knew. From that first round in the first fight, he'd gone for it, and it looked like he was going to take Holyfield out early, and Holyfield come back with it, took it and come back with his own flurry. And I think you could, from that point, Tyson thought, yeah, this geezer's not going to be easy to get rid of. And obviously, he gets the win in the first fight, and in this second one, I think it was pretty much the same. And pretty much the same way. And Tyson I think he knew he had his number, basically. And I can't think who it was, but someone said, like, you know, when a dog gets scared, that's when they bite you, and that's exactly what happened to Tyson. It's crazy to say Mike Tyson being scared, but he really was. And I've never seen anything like it in the ring. I will never see anything like it again, hopefully. But to Holyfield's credit, when he gets a chunk of his ear bitten out, and you know he's ready to carry on, the guy. So it shows you everything you need to know about Holyfield. He had unbelievable heart, unbelievable spirit. But yeah, definitely. Is the famous bite fight? Is it legendary? I think the first one definitely is. The second one is just crazy. It's just X-rated.
It certainly is X-rated. So moving on, then he beats Michael Moorer and then goes in against Vaughn Bean and beats Vaughn Bean via a unanimous decision before then going in the ring with our competitor for this show, which is Mr. Lennox Lewis, and we're going to talk about Lennox Lewis's career, because Lennox Lewis also has had a Hall of Fame career, but leading up to this point he had a completely different route into this particular fight, going from being a British guy born in London, moves over to Canada, competes in the Olympics, wins a gold medal in the Olympics for Canada, then starts his career out as a heavyweight, and then starts to build his heavyweight profile up through the early to mid-90s, and we're going to talk about a couple of notable fights here that I can look back on and say were good, significant things that happened in his career. He beat Gary Mason in 91 for the British and European heavyweight title. I think that was quite a significant moment in his career for him. He beat Mike Weaver, a legendary fighter of the 80s, great fighter of the 80s from the heavyweight scene. Glenn McCrory as well, obviously beat Glenn McCrory in the same year. This all happened in 1991. And then he goes on to beat Tyrell Biggs, a former Tyson opponent. So in the space of 1991, he had 4, I would say, quite significant fights, which really led him on to the next few years of his career.
Yeah, absolutely. He went through that domestic route, didn't he? As you say, East Londoner, although he did move out. He was actually bullied in Canada through his Cockney accent. So that's what brought him into boxing as a kid. So, you know, for anyone that doubted the fact whether again English, he's Canadian. He wasn't. He was an Englishman. He had the Glenn McCrory fight. Was a good, significant fight. Obviously, the Tyrell Briggs, definitely. He put Briggs down 3 times in the third to win that by knockout, and then he went on to win the British title outright against Derek. brilliant in 92.
So he moves on from there then, and he beats Donovan Razor Ruddock at Earl's Court. Great performance there to get the Commonwealth Heavyweight title, or defend the Commonwealth Heavyweight title in that fight. Beats Tony Tucker, another guy from the 80s, to become the World Boxing Council, the WBC World Heavyweight Champion in 93. That was obviously a very significant moment, given the fact that Tony Tucker, like I said, at this point was 48-1 going into the fight with Lennox Lewis. Significant experience over Lewis, but Lewis ground out a unanimous decision over him. And then the next fight was a brilliant fight, fantastic fight. One of the fights that I think British boxing fans will certainly remember is when Lennox Lewis took on Frank Bruno in 1993, defending the WBC title.
It's one of my favourite fights. It was just brilliant. As I said, I was a Bruno fan personally, and I rooted for Bruno that night. And I thought he took sort of early stages out with his jab, but then Lewis come back and finished him eventually in the seventh. Proved he was, he was better than Bruno. I think we sort of thought that Bruno was always the underdog, wasn't he? But it was a great fight. And I believe that fight was at 1 o'clock in the morning, if I remember rightly. It was because they wanted to make sure it went sort of prime time in America. So that was why that fight took place so early in the morning. But just before that, you touched on the Donovan Ruddock fight, and interestingly, that was the time when it was Holyfield was fighting Tyson and Ruddock was fighting Lewis, and it was a contract signed where they were supposed to fight each other as winners. The winners of both fights will fight each other. Riddick Bowe won his fight against Holyfield, and Lewis won his fight against Riddick Bowe. But then we had the famous Riddick Bowe where he threw the WBC belt in the bin. I don't know if anyone recalls that, but yeah, and there was a dispute about sort of splits, which is pretty, you think about how it is today, it's been going on for years, basically. So that issue, and obviously the Tony Tucker fight as well, where, if I remember again, it was, Lewis was supposed to get 2.5 million, if Frank Maloney had accepted Bowe's terms. Lewis was supposed to get 2.5 million. When he threw that belt in the bin, Lewis actually ended up getting $9 million for that fight against Tony Tucker, which was quite interesting as well. So I just wanted to throw those couple of facts in for you before the Bruno fight, but brilliant fight against Bruno, and a good performance from Lewis.
So 1994 comes around, he goes in for a defence against Oliver McCall, who was 24-5 at the time he fought Lennox Lewis. And this is something quite relevant at the moment, this point of the episode, where Oliver McCall beats Lennox Lewis, shockingly beats Lennox Lewis, something that wasn't expected to happen, very much like what's happened over the past week with Anthony Joshua losing to Andy Ruiz Jr. Oliver McCall stopped Lennox Lewis, and Lennox Lewis lost his WBC title. Again, shocking. Nobody expected that to happen at the time. Lennox Lewis was the guy, he was the man. He was the man that people didn't want to fight. He was the man that Riddick Bowe avoided. But yet Oliver McCall goes in there with 5 losses on his record, stops Lennox Lewis to become the WBC heavyweight champion.
It was a second round, and he caught him beautifully with a right hand, and put Lewis down. Lewis did manage to get up. He was staggering about. He still believes to this day he could have carried on, and the referee stopped the fight too early. He was in all sorts of trouble. I mean, one thing I do remember is the McCall leap. I remember him just leaping in the air and touching his toes, because it was such a shock. And it was at Wembley Arena in London. And it was after that fight that Lewis actually fired Pepe Correa, his trainer, and actually hired Emmanuel Stewart, who was actually in McCall's corner on the night as well with the defeat. So, as you say, significant in terms of what we've just witnessed over the weekend. Real shocker for Lewis, and it was back to the drawing board.
It certainly was back to the drawing board for Lennox, and he did come back, however, and he started to pick up TKO victories. One that's most notable for me, or two of them that are most notable for me, happened in 95 and 96. So he won a very lightly regarded IBC, International Boxing Council heavyweight title, against none other than Tommy Morrison, aka Tommy Gunn from Rocky V. Now, he was a hell of a fighter in himself, but Lennox Lewis did a great number and stopped Tommy Morrison Boston and won that lightly regarded title, which then led him on to a great fight with Ray Mercer, which he won via majority decision. So two great fights there in 95 there and 96, which I felt were, again, significant fights leading in to his fight and rematch with Oliver McCall.
Yeah, a brilliant fight with Tommy Morrison and obviously Ray Mercer, and he really started to prove himself that, you know, that was just one of those performances. He was in bad form against McCall in that first fight. You know, with obviously we mentioned Manuel Stewart has come in and he's corrected some of the wrongs. He started to really work on that jab and obviously really establishes himself as one of the main guys in the division. He gets the rematch with McCall, which took a bit of time because Oliver McCall was going through a bit of a crazy moment in his life where he was on crack cocaine and then he went into rehab and then he had an incident for a Christmas tree in some hotel place somewhere. I don't know what it was about, but it looked like it weren't going to happen. Eventually, after coming out of rehab, he come out, he fought McCall, and then obviously he won the WBC heavyweight title and, you know, rectified that loss.
He certainly did rectify that loss, and just touching on that particular fight, it's quite an iconic moment in boxing history. People do look back on this one as one of the strangest things that's happened in boxing history. We talk about obviously the fan man coming in on the parachute with Bowen Holyfield earlier on, but this one was also quite significant because it was quite sad to see Oliver McCall breaking down in the middle of a fight and crying, basically not wanting to carry on the fight. It's much different from Roberto Duran saying he didn't want to carry on the fight. This was different. This guy clearly had mental issues at the time and needed to basically stop the fight, and it's something that we've never seen since, and I don't think we'll ever see again. But in 1997, mental health awareness was completely different, and this was something that became quite prominent after the fact as a result of that. So going on then, he beats Henry Akinwadi via a disqualification in their fight. Quite an interesting one as well. Henry Akinwadi was an absolute beast of a man, and that was a great fight, and I can let you touch on that one in a second. But Gallotta, he fought Andrew Gallotta next, beats Gallotta by KO. And in 98, what a fantastic fight he had with Shannon the Cannon Briggs. Another fantastic fight and another fantastic name in the resume of Lennox Lewis.
Yeah, Shannon Briggs, I mean, he's a bit of a laughing stock at the minute, with his Let's Go champ, but he was a fighter, Shannon. He actually held the lineal world title at the time, which he had just won off of George Foreman. So, it was a great opportunity for Lennox Lewis to pick up the WBC title and obviously pick up the lineal heavyweight title, which at the time was on a decline because George Foreman just completely ruined the title really by fighting sort of low-key fighters. So, but the fight itself was an absolute banger. It was back and forth, and then eventually Briggs he got stopped in the fifth. But a really excellent fight.
It was an excellent fight, and I think it's definitely one that when I talk about his career and talk about some of the fights Lewis was involved in, obviously, you got the Bruno fight there to go looking back on, you've got the Oliver McCall, and I'm not saying it because of obviously the mental health side of things, I'm saying it because it's an iconic moment, a significant moment in the sport of boxing. And then you've got the Shannon Briggs fight, which was a brilliant fight to watch, and I remember watching it. I do vaguely remember watching that fight because I remember, Shannon Briggs coming in there so fast, so accurate. He was billed as obviously this guy who was going to come in there and stop Lewis, and then Lewis just managed to find that way of beating him, and he did. And then Lewis moved on in his career. Then he got unanimous decision against I can't pronounce his name, Marovic.
Marovic. Yeah, that's the one.
So he defended the WBC title against Marovic, which leads nicely in then to the fight that we're discussing today, which is against Evander Holyfield. So then let's move on. Let's go into the main bulk of this episode. Then we're going to talk about the build-up to the fight, because obviously the build-up was very significant, because these two guys had obviously, these were the top guys of the division at the time. It was so significant, this particular fight, because the heavyweight landscape had been a bit hit and miss for the past few years, with the likes of Tyson coming back and then going away again, and then you had the likes of obviously Lewis on the scene, you had Riddick Bowe, Holyfield, and then George Foreman even at the age of 46. It was a bit chaotic, I think, in the 90s, and it was a great time for boxing, don't get me wrong, but it was quite a chaotic situation when this fight occurred. But at the time this fight occurred, we had the IBF world title on the line, the vacant IBO world title on the line, the WBA title on the line, and the WBC title, all up for grabs from both men. It was a real interesting build-up into the fight. What are your initial memories of the build-up to this particular fight?
I do remember they were the best two for me at the time. I felt that they were the two best heavyweights around. So the excitement was there. You got the two best heavyweights fighting each other for the first time, and anyone that had watched both fighters, Evander Holyfield brought that heart and that spirit. And one thing about Evander Holyfield, watching him through as a cruiserweight, I wasn't around. I was around, but I wasn't really a watch. I'm looking on stuff back in the day when you look at the cruiserweight stuff for Evander Holyfield, but he had the ability to throw a beautiful combination, and as I say, his heart was always there, and he's always ready to get on the inside. He could take a shot, and then you had Lennox Lewis, who had the long reach, and under Emmanuel had just developed into this, had this immaculate jab, and then would go around right. He had the ability to be able to box the fighter, keep him away, and then put him away. He was a good boxer puncher. He weren't just a jab. Like he wouldn't just win a fight by rounds. I mean, Larry Holmes is always going to be known for sort of the master of the jabs, and Ali obviously as well. But Lewis was up there with him. The way Emmanuel got him fighting and just worked on all his floors. So it was just massive. And I think Bob Fitzsimmons was the last undisputed, if you like, 100 years ago. So that was the billing, was it? That although we had world champions, no one was the undisputed world champion. And Lewis had the opportunity for this glorious moment to beat an American in his own backyard and become a heavyweight undisputed world champion, which was the first we'd seen in 100 years. And funny enough, Bob Fitzsimmons had lost to James Jeffries exactly 100 years ago in New York. So it was all just simmering nicely, and it was just the excitement around the fight, and even Holyfield coming out saying he's going to beat him up in 2 rounds and he's going to put him away in 3. So it was just I just remember getting ready and staying up all night to watch this fight because it was so big.
What was the difference maker in this was that Holyfield's normally such a mild-mannered guy at this point. You didn't really see a lot of spite in him, even with the stuff he'd been through with Tyson. He was normally just a mild-mannered character, but he was quite uncharacteristic in this one. It wasn't like him to sit there and say, I'm going to dominate the first 2 rounds of the fight before knocking Lewis out in the third. That, to me, sort of screamed out, this guy he's genuinely concerned. He's genuinely concerned about the threat that Lewis poses against him, because why would he sit there and throw out these comments when he'd never threw comments about other opponents before? To me, it was kind of, he knew Lewis might have his number in this one, and that's what I think, and that's why I think he said these things at the time, because he knew he was in for a hell of a night against Lennox Lewis. But it wasn't really majorly the most entertaining of build-ups that we've covered in the Legendary Night series, but I think the most notable part of it is what you said and I've just said there about Holyfield coming out and predicting when he's going to end the fight, and that's not normally something he did going into this fight. And I think it led us nicely into what was billed as a huge heavyweight fight at the time, billed as Holyfield versus Lewis. So Holyfield was the A side essentially in this, and Lewis was the B side, although he held a world title himself and a lineal title. It was obviously Evander Holyfield. He was the guy. He was the American fighter. He was in America. He was significant. Don King, obviously, you know what he's like, sniffing around. One thing that was quite significant about it was, like you said earlier and touched on, about Lewis getting Emmanuel Stewart, who also used to train Evander Holyfield as well.
Yes, he did. Yes, he was one of his trainers. Yeah. Yes, so it's interesting. They had that. He would have known about Holyfield and what he brings at close knit, if you like. So it was always a plus to have him in your corner. And obviously, you saying Evander Holyfield being the A side, I mean, he was the one that got he got $20 million, and Lewis got 10. So just from the purses themselves, you could see that he was considered the A side, and Lewis just accepted it. And he went to America and he was like, I'm going to beat this guy, and he bit the bullet. He wanted that recognition. He wanted to be the first guy since Riddick Bowe to be the undisputed heavyweight champion, which was in '92. So there was a lot on the line for both guys. And we took 7,000 British fans out to watch Lewis, and if you listen to the fight, whether you listen to it on HBO or you listen to it on Sky, you can hear that sort of football vibe, English fans singing Lewis, and that's one thing we get as a British fighter. You go to America, I mean, people say, yeah, you might not get the decision out there, but you do get the fans, and they really do back our fighters, and it was a big fight. I think even the actual gate, it produced 13.5 million as well. As you say, it was a Don King promotion. And also, one thing I noticed was that Arthur Vashanti Jr. was actually the son of, obviously, Arthur Vashanti Sr., but his dad was actually, referee in the fight of the century in 1971 between Ali and Frazier. So, just to throw that in as well.
Yeah, great little fact there to throw in. So, the fight itself then. So, after watching the fight back recently to cover it for this episode, we touched on it both at the beginning. I touched on it at the start of the episode. You touched on it just after me. It wasn't the most enthralling of fights to watch as such, but it did have some entertaining and good moments within the fight. So just starting out then, Johnston, the first round was it was quite hectic. Both of them came out of the blocks and both of them wanted to take centre ring in the first round of the fight. They both threw and landed some great power punches. I think towards the end of round number 1, you could see Holyfield was starting to get a little bit frustrated that he wasn't able to get through on Lewis as much as what he wanted to. And at one point towards the end of round number 1, Holyfield, he literally tries to wrestle Lewis to the ground, which I thought was quite entertaining. Because straight away, that, again, watching it back now, against watching it at the time, was like, you could tell then that, for me, Holyfield straight away knew he was going to be in for a difficult night. And I know I said it a little bit earlier, but that was evident to me straight away. He couldn't out-hustle him, he couldn't muscle him in that first round. So what did he do? He just decided to sort of show his physical strength by trying to wrestle him to the ground.
Just occasionally a little tentative with that jab, Lewis. They'll have both fought this fight 1,000 times in their head. Holyfield has some big physical problems to overcome if he needs to get close to Lewis. Holyfield, you'd think, would want to get onto the inside where he can unleash those damaging hooks. Right to the body. Lewis just off balance more than anything. He's caught by the left hook and a right hand. Best yet from Holyfield.
Holyfield will try to get into his rhythm. When he lets his punches go in that rhythm, he looks very, very good.
Oh, and Holyfield there lifted Lewis by his backside off his feet. What an extraordinary end to the opening round.
Yeah, it was a bit of a bizarre incident, wasn't it? Where he lifted him up and it was like he's going to throw him over his head at one point. But yeah, for Lewis's jab, I mean, he established the jab nice and early. He was going to keep Evander Holyfield bait. In the first 2 rounds, for me, he won quite clearly. Although Holyfield, he sort of said he was going to do what he was going to do in the first 2 rounds. He didn't quite deliver. He didn't throw enough shots. And Lewis was just able to just keep him away, keep him at bay. And as he come in close, he would sort of just tie him up. So the first 2 rounds was pretty much Lewis's rounds. And then obviously we moved into that 3rd round, and that's when Holyfield was sort of saying in his corner, this is the round he goes at. So when he was he was speaking to his corner, so you knew he was going to come out and he's going to go for it, and he did, and he won the round. He won the 3rd round quite clearly. He was throwing some combinations, and he did catch Lewis, who was up against the ropes, and then he threw a massive haymaker, which Lewis managed to get out of the way of. So you're thinking now, actually, right, so he hasn't got rid of him in the 3rd, but he's going to have a go now. This fight's going to really heat up. And one thing I did notice was the guard. Lewis's guard was so high up, it was almost protecting his belly. One thing that watching back on, I didn't really notice it at the time, or I don't remember noticing it, and the referee didn't even say it. So yeah, just interesting that he had it so high.
And that 3rd round in particular, like you say, was where Holyfield came out. He landed a great left hook in that round, and he backed Lewis up against the ropes, who he covered up quite well, to be fair to him. Holyfield did get a couple of shots off, but Lewis was really on point, fighting off the ropes. They were both exchanging really, really hard blows at the end of the round, and I think it led nicely into the 4th round, where Holyfield again came out and was trying to get the better of the action, and for me, for the majority of the round, did get the better of the action in the 4th round. And then moving into the 5th, I think this is where the fight started to turn the tide a little bit, because Lewis stunned Holyfield with a right hand, backed him up into the corner. Within the first minute of round number 5, Holyfield took some punishment in that round from Lewis, and they're my thoughts from round number 5, was that Lewis just absolutely went to town on Evander Holyfield, and Evander Holyfield, you know, it was quite lucky, to be honest with you, because there was exchanges in that round where I felt like if that would have been a referee today, they might have even jumped in at one point.
The jab from Lewis. I think it's the key for Lewis's game plan to use that jab well and then bring the right hand behind it.
Clubbing right seemed to just hurt Holyfield momentarily. Wanted to cover up, but his powers of recovery are brilliant usually because of his conditioning. I wonder if he's just trying to kid Lewis here. Oh, right hand, looked a cracker from Lewis. Holyfield covering up. Some of these are landing on the arms, but he definitely got through with a couple.
Two very, very heavy right hands from Lewis.
He's measuring him for size. There was a right uppercut too. Lewis back on top here. And there's that body shot that Manny Stewart, the trainer, asked him for. Oh, and there's a right uppercut and a right cross. Left hook to the body. Holyfield in trouble here. Holyfield swaying on those ropes. And here he is in another crisis in his career. But this man is probably the best boxer of all time in a crisis.
Holyfield needing all his knowledge of survival there, blocking the shot, trying to turn away from him just to take that little bit of power out of him, but he doesn't really need to stand and take shots like that from Lewis.
Yeah, he did. I mean, Lewis landed that big right hand right on the top of Holyfield's head, and it did look. And he sort of had him on the ropes, didn't he? And he caught him with some big uppercuts as well. And it did look a little bit worse for wear. And maybe the reputation of Holyfield allowed the referee to just allow it to, you know, for it to continue. But I mean, he was on the ropes. I've got to notice that 45 seconds he was on the ropes without throwing a punch. So, as we say today, that it could have easily, someone could have stepped in it. It would have been a quick and probably a wrong stoppage. But, you know, to be fair, I mean, you know, 45 seconds without throwing a punch and you're getting hit on the ropes, you know, in a way, you're sort of surrendering it. But, as I say, reputation probably helped Holyfield. Everyone knew he had a solid chin and he could carry on, and obviously he did. But he did actually, I think there was a small cut which opened up on the bridge of Lewis's nose right on the end of the 5th as well. So he must, whether it was his head, because he sort of leaned in with his head a little bit, but it was a very good 5th round. I really enjoyed that 5th round, and I'm with you, and I feel that it was looking like Lewis is going to really take control of this fight.
And in the 6th round, Holyfield actually hurt Lewis early on in the round, but then Lewis landed an absolute peach of an uppercut which hurt Holyfield. So you could see Holyfield, as gritty and as determined and all the heart that he had in the world, Lewis was still just outgunning him. So no matter what Holyfield threw at Lewis, Lewis always had a response, and that was quite significant, and what would be quite significant for the remainder of the fight. Round number 7, you could see here, Holyfield starting to get frustrated now. He comes tumbling towards Lewis, basically bringing both of them to the floor. It was like he'd speared him. It was like an American football tackle. It was hilarious to watch, but you could see that it was frustration more than anything. You know, he just kind of came in trying to throw a punch, but it just ended up taking him down instead. And then Lewis landed multiple combinations, and he couldn't miss at this point. This is where Holyfield starts to follow him round the ring a little bit, and even the commentator made a point as well. When you listen back to the HBO commentary, they're saying to him, Holyfield's following him around the ring. This is where I think he starts to sort of unravel a little bit. Not significantly, but unravel a bit, where I think Lewis, he's got the psychological edge in the fight.
I wonder how they've got this so far as we move into the second half of the contest. Here's how Glenn's seeing it.
Well, I'm seeing it with Lewis 2 rounds ahead, winning the last 2. Now they both wrestle to the floor.
Oh, Holyfield not happy about all that.
That's going to stop right now. Let's act like champions.
Let's act like champions, says referee Arthur McCarthy Jr. Stop all that. It got a bit nasty and silly. It wasn't a knockdown. Oh, and look at Lewis straight away. Hits him with a jab and a lowish-looking punch as well. And Manny Stewart is shouting at Lewis to unload. Don't be tentative. Let the power tallies. Saying he's banging on the ring apron. Manny Stewart, the trainer.
Well, he waited too long there. He allowed Holyfield off the ropes. That was a point where Lewis should have really followed his conviction, followed up with punches. He stung Holyfield just on the break. He should have followed that up.
It's the enigmatic part of Lennox Lewis's nature. It's why some in America have doubted him. His answer would be, look, I know what I'm doing. Lewis all the time wary of the left hook of Holyfield that floored both Bo and Tyson.
This is where Manny Stewart wants Lewis to take over, to be the boss, to really impose himself on Holyfield. Still a little cautious, Lewis.
Another good right hand, and again Manny Stewart, the trainer, waves Lewis in, but he refuses to do that. He doesn't want to get stuck up by counters. Great uppercut, then a left hook from Lewis. Holyfield has to take those again, and this is good from Lennox Lewis here, mixing them up. He's dominating, he's winning this at the moment, and I do stress at the moment. He's got him again. Holyfield's face is swelling up. This looks so good for Lennox Lewis at this stage.
Oh, absolutely. The 7th round was probably, I mean, we talk about the 5th, but the 7th round was probably the round of the fight. And I thought from this point, you know, watching it live at the time and watching it back, I mean, you sort of think, oh, this fight's really going to ignite now. And Lewis, it was a clear round for Lewis, that round. I mean, he threw a right uppercut, he threw a left hand and then a right hand. It was a wonderful combination on Holyfield. It really did. It dug him in, and it did hurt Holyfield. And it was looking one-way traffic at this point. And as you say, he literally just tackled him to the floor, didn't he, Holyfield? You could sense the frustration in the guy. He really wanted to just get inside and have a tussle like he did with it, but Lewis weren't going to allow him to do that. Lewis was a clever fighter. He had a clever guy in the corner with Evander Holyfield, who, you know, it was just literally about keeping him away and tying him up if he got close. And there was the telltale signs of Holyfield's swollen left eye as well by the end of the 7th round, and you're sort of thinking, yeah, this is going to be one-way traffic. And then the one thing that happened in the 7th was the ref, Shannon, he showed some excellent reflexes and just avoided Evander Holyfield's left hook.
Yeah, that was actually the video that we posted out on the Twitter and Facebook pages of the referee dodging that left hook. That was some Matrix stuff going on there, weren't it? That dodging, and telling you, it was
brilliant, wasn't it?
Unbelievable. But going back to rounds number 8 and 9, I think Lewis, for me, you know, had taken them. He was starting to box quite comfortably, I think, at this point, and he was boxing quite well as on the back foot as Holyfield was coming forward. He was keeping Holyfield at bay with a jab, and I think it was where we get into round number 10 is where Holyfield's obviously been told, he must have been told by his corner at this point, you need to go out there and be more aggressive in this fight because you're losing it, because he came out so aggressive for that 10th round. He come forward, he landed a couple of great notable shots in the round, but Lewis, although he was under fire from Holyfield, still managed to get a few great shots off of his own. And I think it was the same in round 11, to be honest, as well. It was very much the same for rounds 10, 11 and 12. It was a case of Holyfield knew he had to win rounds in the fight, and to do that he had to come forward, be aggressive, and had to take chances in the fight as well. And as obviously we get into rounds 11 and 12, you can see they're both exhausted. Lewis starts to open up a little bit more, but both of them are starting to open up on each other. And I think the final stanza, the championship rounds as they call them, rounds 10, 11 and 12, were quite entertaining ones, because we got to see the skill of Lennox Lewis fighting under pressure, and we also got to see the heart and determination of Evander Holyfield trying his hardest to win that fight.
Yeah, I think for me, Holyfield started to actually throw some punches. I mean, he had obviously had some success in rounds previous, but in particular, rounds sort of 10 and 11 for me, I gave them to Holyfield just because he started to really, he got right in front of Lewis. Whether Lewis, as you say, was getting tired gradually. I mean, the jab wasn't popping the head back as much, was it? It was a pouring jab, but it sort of Evander Holyfield was able to come in on the jabs. He was able to get in close, and he threw some big shots himself. Obviously, he got caught, but as you say, Lewis showing his style and his ability to be able to, you know, to manoeuvre himself out of trouble. When Holyfield did get close enough, he was allowed to back him up. And in a way, I suppose Lewis, whether he, as you say, whether he's tired or whether he just sort of allowed Holyfield to just close that gap a little bit, and he was just catching him with some good shots. But you know, Lewis he felt in control. I think as you're watching the fight, although Evander Holyfield picked up that, for me, he picked up round 10 and 11. You know, going into the 12th, I just think Lewis needed to just win it, just to make 100% sure. And for me, that's exactly what he did. I thought he won the 12th round. It was another good round. The crowd was singing, even shouting, sort of chanting Lewis's name. And even when Holyfield sort of was still trying his best to try and catch the shot. I mean, he must have known he needs to knock Lewis out to win this fight. I think that's what he was thinking in his head. And Lewis was a master at just keeping the fighter at bay and just being able to clinch when they come in close and just avoid any big shots. And you know, the reactions from the bell, I think says it all. The way Lewis puts his hands in the air and Holyfield sort of just turns away, because I think Holyfield deep down knew he lost the fight, but it was well, yeah, he didn't, but you know, we're getting to that in a minute. But I enjoyed right at the end of the fight. I was getting into it. I mean, we all were at home, and it was a great sort of last few rounds, and it was exciting. And you think Lewis has done this. This is it. Lewis has won the fight. There's no way Evander Holyfield is going to get a result here tonight.
I think what was the telling factor for me at the end of the fight was the fact that, as you said there, Lennox Lewis raises his arms. Evander Holyfield just sort of, the body language always tells you the story at the end of the fight, and this was no different. Evander Holyfield just looked like he knew he'd lost, essentially. And then we move on to the scorecards, and it was, you know, Lennox Lewis looked really confident when they do the split screen of both of them, and they're both there, and you could see Lewis looks confident, his corner looked confident, and they read out the scorecard 116-113 to Lewis, and they read out the scorecard 115-113 to Holyfield, and you can see the bemusement start to creep into the face of Lewis and his corner, and then you get the English judge who scored it 115-115 a draw, and it was like, what the hell has just happened here?
Ladies and gentlemen, after 12 rounds of boxing here at Madison Square Garden, we go to the scorecards at this time. Judge at ringside, Eugenia Williams, scores about 115 to 113 in favor of Evander Holyfield.
American
Judge
judge.
at ringside, Stanley Christodoulou, scores about 116 to 113 in favor of Lennox Lewis.
British judge next.
Judge at ringside, Larry O'Connell, scores the bout 115 to 115, even a draw. The decision is even a draw. Both champions retain their
It is
belts.
a draw, and it is a draw because Larry O'Connell, the London judge, scored it even. What about that?
Unbelievable. The irony in that the London judge has given it even. It's a draw for Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, and Lewis is shocked by that.
He cannot believe that, Lennox Lewis. Well, I did warn you. I did say be cautious, because you never know how the judges are reading it. But I think Lennox Lewis has won that fight, and I'll go out on a limb here. I think he's been robbed.
This was a clear win for Lennox Lewis, and even the great late Harold Lederman had Lewis, I think it was about 4 or 5 rounds up at this point, at the end of the fight. So for a guy that had been doing it for such a long time, and most ringside observers having Lewis win this fight, but yet the judges didn't have it the same. And what was quite interesting to find out about this is, after the facts had happened and the decision had been made, and we went away and we had the rest of history come about, it actually turned out that the American judge, Eugenia Williams, she declared Evander Holyfield the winner. Now, she initially denied that there was any wrongdoing in that scorecard, and after reviewing a replay of the fight, she stated she still would have called it a draw, which was quite interesting. But then the British judge, Larry O'Connell, who scored the fight a draw, he also received a fair amount of criticism, of course, with him being a British judge and, you know, giving it a draw. He had actually said he'd made a mistake. He said he feels sorry for himself. He'd taken all that stick, but he felt even more sorry for Lennox Lewis because he'd made a decision which had impacted that particular fight. And as we talk about briefly in the aftermath, it essentially didn't lead on to as much damage as what you thought it would have done, but at the time it was a very controversial decision. And one more little bit of information before you jump in there, Johnston, is punch stats. Lewis landed 348 power punches in that fight against Holyfield's 130. That's pretty much near enough double of what Holyfield had landed in the fight, and for me that tells you the story of how the fight went.
Oh, absolutely. I've always meant before, Sean, that I'm not a massive fan of punch stats, but it was clear to see that Lewis won the fight. Even without that, he won the fight. I mean, it was a dreadful decision. It was met with loud boos from the crowd. As you mentioned, Jim Lampley on HBO and George Foreman, they were calling it a travesty and a shame. There was all sorts of even the New York mayor came. Who was Ruddy Giuliani. I'm probably murdering the guy's name. But he came out and said, "I'm embarrassed to be a New Yorker. I know boxing as well as I know being mayor. There's no way Holyfield won the fight. This is a travesty what happened." And as you've mentioned before, obviously Larry O'Connor came out and said he felt pig sick about the whole thing, and he felt embarrassed for himself, and obviously sorry that Lennox didn't get the result. But the one interesting bit of information I've picked up was the Sunday Mirror actually put on the front of their paper that they basically indicated that Judge Eugenia Williams basically had taken a bung deal, basically. So they were saying that there was a secret bank account with a total of $30,000 in it after the fight. Eugene obviously decided no, she's not having this, took her to court and actually ended up getting a settlement. So good for her, to be fair. Poor judging. She actually didn't do any work again until 2003, which just shows you how people, thought, God, who wants this woman to be judging her. So, unbelievable decision. It was probably, it's got to be up there with one of the worst decisions ever. One of the most controversial decisions in boxing history. I still can't believe it. Anyone could call it a draw. It is what it is, and as we know, it didn't have massive significant impact on what happened. Obviously, we got the rematch, but yeah, really, really poor decision. But what can you do? It will always go down in history as one of those robberies.
I'm saying, did he hit me with a jab? I hit him with jabs all night.
Did he ever shake you up?
No, not in the least, not one bit. I cannot believe the outcome.
As the rounds were clicking on, was there any doubt in your mind that maybe things were getting close, that perhaps you really had to put them away, that you needed a 10-8 round, that you needed to win with conviction down the stretch?
No, I felt that I won. I lost at least about 2 rounds. I lost 2 rounds. That's all I felt.
What about a rematch right now? Can you take any solace in the fact that you're completely convinced you're the better man? How do you walk away from this and leave it alone? You have to go right back at him?
Well, I believe there should be an automatic rematch. I doubt if he's going to want to fight me again. Like I said in the beginning, Evander Holyfield never seen nothing like Lennox Lewis, and he looked like an old man in there. He looked slow to me. He was missing a lot of punches. I hit him with jabs, right hands. He was hurt a couple times. I don't even know what the judges were looking at.
So what are we going to look for now? I mean, how do you go back to work Monday?
Disappointed, but I'm happy because the whole world's seen it for themselves. I know they wouldn't let me. I know they wouldn't let me leave with all 3 belts without trying to do some kind of funny business. It worried me because it was a Don King promotion. But what can I say? I boxed him in his home turf and still won.
It certainly will. So let's go into the final segment of the episode then, the aftermath for both fighters. As you said there, the rematch happened later on in 1999, and we got the final victory for Lennox Lewis. He got the unanimous decision in what was a better fight than the first fight, a more quality fight, but an even bigger fight because of obviously the scandal of the first fight. So he got that win. He moved on. He beat the likes of Michael Grant, Francis Botha, David Chua, before he bumped into Hasim Rahman in South Africa, where he got KO'd with what was called the Lucky Punch. Now, there's plenty of stories about what happened there, and I would recommend you go and listen to Lennox Lewis directly. He's on Mike Tyson's podcast, Bite the Mic. If you go and have a listen to the interview with Lennox Lewis about the Hasim Rahman fight, it's a very interesting listen because actually there was a lot of surrounding factors going on at the time going into that. But immediately, as we've seen with what's happened over the weekend with Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz, what happened was Hasim Rahman had to give the rematch to Lennox Lewis, and Lennox Lewis went in there and produced a stunning 5th round KO. And then we got the fight that we'd wanted to see 10 years earlier, 11 years earlier. Lennox Lewis versus Mike Tyson. Absolute fantastic memories of the build up to this. Probably, again, we've said it earlier about other fights, this has definitely got to be a legendary nights episode and got to go in one of the polls in the future, because, you know, I could sit here and talk about that one all day because of how good the build up was to this particular fight. But he knocked out Mike Tyson in 2002, and then in his final fight of his career was an absolute barnstormer against Vitaly Klitschko, where he won via a stoppage because of the cuts on Vitaly Klitschko's eye. So that summed up the career of Lennox Lewis. A Hall of Fame worthy career, fantastic career, great for British boxing. And then we move on to Evander Holyfield, who stayed on just a little bit longer than Lennox Lewis, in fact, and stuck around. So after he lost to Lewis, fought John Ruiz, beat Ruiz to win back the vacant WBA heavyweight title, then lost to Ruiz, then fought Ruiz for a third time in a row and got a split decision draw, which was again quite interesting. And then he beat Hasim Rahman in 2002, and then he fought Chris Bird, James Toney, Larry Donald. I mean, look at all the names that are on there. And as he decided to come back a little bit further down the line, at this point we start to think, you know, he should retire here. He goes in, starts fighting these lower ranked names in the heavyweight division, and then he went in and beat Francis Botha, which was in 2010. But before he beat Botha in 2008, he actually fought the giant Nikolai Valuev, in which was a controversial decision in that one, because I felt he'd got the victory against Valuev. He should have been the WBA heavyweight champion yet again in 2008. But then he went in, fought Sherman Williams, which was a no contest, and then finished his career in 2011 against Brian Nielsen. So again, both of them had fantastic Hall of Fame worthy careers. You know, Holyfield, cruiserweight champion, heavyweight champion multiple times. Lennox Lewis, multiple heavyweight champion. Just two great fighters, and you know, two great fighters that shared the ring together twice and gave us some of the best rounds of boxing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Evander Holyfield, you know, he's still the only guy to be a undisputed champion at cruiserweight and heavyweight. 3-time world champion. Unbelievable career. I mean, you touched on the value of fight. I mean, that was a dreadful fight. Absolutely disgusting. It was a poor result, but it was a really bad fight as well. He really should have knocked it on the head at that point. But yeah, I mean, just even Lennox Lewis, I mean, 100% Hall of Famer. He obviously finally got the Tyson fight, which I was really pleased about. I remember having debates till the sun come up with my mates about whether who's going to win this fight, and I always just fancied Lewis just for the jab, and I knew he'd keep Tyson at bay, and I just felt that Tyson wasn't at his peak. But what a brilliant fight that was, and all the drama and all the build up. But that was for me, that was Lennox Lewis, one of his best performances. I just thought it was outstanding that night against Mike Tyson. And obviously the Vitaly Klitschko, where he said he got stopped. He was actually up on all three of the scorecards, Klitschko, and obviously he got stopped because of the cut, which I think he had about 60 odd stitches in, so it was a really bad one. But it looked like he was going to have the rematch with Vitaly, and I think Lewis probably thought, I'm not going to win the rematch, so he called it a day. He done the right thing. Whereas Evander Holyfield, where we talk about the heart and the desire of Holyfield, and you see that throughout his whole career. But I just think maybe that he had such a big heart that he just didn't know when to stop. He just kept going, and he probably needed to call it a day a lot earlier than he did. Obviously, fighting on to 2011 wasn't a good, wise move. But, you know, still an absolute legend, a Hall of Famer, the pair of them, and it was great looking back on a huge night of boxing. Okay, it didn't live up to the bill, but in terms of quality of the fight, it was still a quality fight. There was still they showed how much ability they both had. But in terms of just brutality, if you like, it didn't quite live up to that. But magnificent fight, obviously with all the controversy that surrounded it, but two great heavyweights, and will always go down as absolute legends.
And that is the episode. So if you've enjoyed listening to this episode of Legendary Nights, the tale of Holyfield versus Lewis, and you know what to do. You know to go and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, or on Podbean, or on Stitcher, Spreaker, Player FM, Spotify. Find us on Twitter at BTR Boxing Pod, and Facebook, BTR Boxing Podcast. So this is this week's Legendary Nights, Holyfield versus Lewis. Check out the polls coming over the coming weekend for the next episode, and you get your chance to vote on that. So please exercise your right to vote on this particular next fight, and we've really enjoyed covering this one. Johnston, as always, thank you so much for coming on this.
Thank you very much for letting me on the episode again, and keep up the good work, Sean. Doing great work. BTR Boxing, check it out, subscribe.
That's it, guys. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss, a tremendous victory.